She said it wasn't until the mid-70s or so that we started to learn that this was not allowed. Good afternoon, friends. In this video, I'm going to tell you about why the UAE only became religious recently. But before I do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video for the sake of the algorithm. Now let's get started. First of all, before we get started, some background information. In a previous video, I talked about the creation of the modern state, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. In that video, I actually discussed how Saudi Arabia became religious. For those that didn't watch the video on Saudi Arabia, we should take some notes here. The first is that Saudi Arabia is the biggest state in the Arabian Peninsula. The other states, including the UAE, essentially exist because they refused to join the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. One of the reasons that they refused to join it was at the time, they didn't entirely agree with the version of Islam that Saudi Arabia propagated. And that brings us to our second point, which is that Saudi Arabia, by its definition, was some kind of theocracy. The state of Saudi Arabia, in fact, there were 3 states that were spread over time, was spread by a family called Al Saud that allied itself with a family called Al Sheikh. These are the descendants of a man named Muhammad bin Saud and a man named Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. The second group, those are the descendants of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, spread a version of Islam that has been incorrectly and honestly offensively called Wahhabism by Western scholars. We call it Salafism because the Salaf are the original people, older, that means literally our ancestors. And so Salafi means the people that follow a kind of ancestral version of Islam. So basically a certain kind of fundamentalist old kind of Islam was spread by this family across the Arabian Peninsula. And the governorships that agreed to join their cause, which was essentially a call toward a caliphate, but eventually turned into a kingdom through a certain betrayal, which we don't need to get into here, those governorships that joined them, essentially joined them because they agreed with that kind of Islam that the Al Saud family was propagating. So how you could think of it here is that the states that remained, that didn't join Saudi Arabia, were states that either did not trust the Al Saud family or their message, which was to create a caliphate, justly so, because they never created a caliphate, or they didn't agree with that version of Islam, which was often the case. In this video, we're going to take as an example the United Arab Emirates. Those are 7 emirates, sort of like 7 states that united together to form a country in the 70s. These states were formerly called the Trucial States due to a truce that they had with the United Kingdom. They were protectorates, and this is one of the reasons actually that they were protected from the expansion of Saudi Arabia. The reason why I'm using as an example the United Arab Emirates is because that's where my paternal side of my family come from, and I know a lot of detailed information that is not available in history books and cannot be found elsewhere about the United Arab Emirates, although this also applies to Qatar, to Bahrain, and also to Kuwait. But in particular, we're going to talk about the United Arab Emirates here. And the reason why I thought to make a video about this is because I've noticed throughout my life that living in the West, Western people tend to think of Arabs, and particularly Arabs that wear their traditional clothing in the Arabian Peninsula. You see, the Arabs that live outside the Arabian Peninsula don't necessarily look like Arabs to you guys. They often wear pants and shirts, whereas the ones that live in the Arabian Peninsula wear traditional clothing. And in the West, this is often seen as some kind of religious conservatism in particular. And in the West, oftentimes I've noticed that Western people think that Arabs are necessarily religious. In fact, this is actually quite the opposite. The reason why these Arabs wear traditional clothing is because of cultural reasons, not because of religious reasons. And in fact, the people that lived in these countries, in particular the UAE, were notoriously and particularly impious until very recently. They recently became religious through the influence of a certain people, the Egyptians. This story has never been told, not on print or on video. Let me tell you the story of how the UAE became religious. First of all, we have to distinguish between the historical kinds of Arabs. There are 2 kinds of Arabs historically. They are the settled Arabs, the city dwellers, non-nomadic people, and they are the nomadic Arabs that are in modern times called Bedouins, although historically they were called Al-A'rab in Arabic. Originally, according to our own records, the Arabs are thought to have been a nomadic people. In fact, the Arabic language is distinguished among Semitic languages, including Aramaic, the language of Jesus, and the language Hebrew, which is in modern times spoken in Israel, by the fact that the Arabic peoples, the ones that spoke that language, were mostly tribal people that remained nomadic. So the Arabic language, in fact, was distinguished because the Semitic people who were nomadic tended to speak Arabic, whereas those that inhabited cities tended to have other languages. So the Arabic language itself is intertwined with nomadism, in that nomadic Semitic peoples tended to speak Arabic, and that language has always been tied to nomadic peoples. And so the Arabs think of themselves as having originally been nomadic, and some eventually turned into city dwellers. And in fact, if you follow Arabic history very closely, you'll find that nomadic Arabs often settled for hundreds of years even, and then went back to nomadism. And this happened back and forth throughout history, at the very least in North Africa, in Syria, and in the Arabian Peninsula, the center of the Arabs, where the Arabs come from and where the Arabic language comes from. Let me give you an example of this. So for example, most people know that the religion of Islam is thought to have began with the Prophet Muhammad. Muhammad bin Abdullah was a man from a tribe called Quraysh that inhabited Mecca. They were considered city dwellers. They were settled peoples. In fact, if any of you guys are Muslims and listening to this, you'll notice that if you read the Sahihan, the two most trustworthy books that have sayings of the Prophet, you'll notice that he sometimes encounters Bedouins and treats them a little bit differently than city dwellers. For example, you'll find exchanges between Muhammad and someone who is from Al-A'rab. Those are the Bedouins. They were not originally called Bedouins in his time, they were called A'rab. By the way, the etymology of the word A'rab is very fascinating. If any Arabs are listening to this, or Muslims, you'll notice that it seems very similar to the word Arab. In fact, it's a more exaggerated version of that. Anyway, let me just give you an example of how the Prophet Muhammad sometimes interacted with Bedouins. So, paraphrase, there's a hadith in Sahih Muslim in which the Prophet Muhammad encountered one of these, what we would call nowadays Bedouins. The Bedouin came up to the Prophet and asked him what Islam was. The Prophet gave this man a very brief description of Islam. He described the prayers, zakat, the pillars of Islam. When that man left, the friends, the companions of the Prophet, called the Sahaba, inquired as to why the Prophet Muhammad didn't give the man more detail. And essentially, the Prophet Muhammad said that according to our ability to understand something is something demanded upon us, such that this Bedouin person, due to his potential illiteracy and so on, may not be able to handle the level of detail that the Prophet may need to give somebody else. So this man would be liable only for what he knows. And this was an important learning lesson for Muslims. Anyway, the Bedouins existed back then. They were called Arab, and they still exist today. In fact, by the 1700s, some of the descendants of the Prophet through Ali, you have to understand, the Prophet's first cousin married his daughter. So we consider those people his descendants. Anyway, the Banu Hashim, some of them returned to being Bedouins and in fact became what we call in Arabic قُطَّاعُ الطُّرُق, which means the people who cut the pathways of the roads. They're essentially robbers. They became robbers of the Hujjaj, the people going to Hajj, to pilgrimage in Mecca. Fascinatingly and a bit ironically. So the Prophet's descendants actually began to rob some of the people that were coming to Mecca to do pilgrimage because the Prophet told them to. Anyway, the descendants of those people still exist in Saudi Arabia and they are considered the Bedouin sheikhs of the Banu Hashim. So the point is, throughout history, the Arabs, particularly in the Arabian Peninsula, have been nomadic or settled. The cultures of the two differ dramatically. Generally, Bedouins looked down upon settled Arabs. They thought of them as effeminate and weak and lacking their cultural identity, whereas the city dwellers considered Bedouins to be simple people that don't understand things, can't accomplish things, can't unify properly, and so on. Now, because of the environment in the Arabian Peninsula, most Bedouin tribes that developed some kind of material possessions and success or aspirations toward those things eventually moved out of the region. So they moved toward, for example, what is now Syria, or they moved toward Iraq, or they moved toward North Africa with the expansion of the Islamic Empire. So a lot of people from the Arabian Peninsula, from Bedouin tribes, settled those areas. And they settled them at various times. For example, there were hundreds of thousands of Bedouins settled in North Africa up to the 11th century. And there were more settled 500 years later, and so on. What this did essentially is, by late Ottoman times, the Arabian Peninsula basically mostly contained Bedouin people, except for in Mecca and Medina, and maybe in Oman and a couple of other areas, Yemen, parts of Yemen. But generally, most people there were the people who refused to become city dwellers. They were still Bedouin tribes, living in a very harsh climate, very harsh lives. And these people prided themselves on a few things. One is their freedom. This is something very little understood in the West because Western people never fully understood Arabic cultures, particularly Bedouin culture. Bedouins love freedom. They love the freedom of the desert. They love the idea that there is no one that can control them and tell them what to do with their lives. They have no responsibilities. And more than that, in fact, the way of the Bedouin lifestyle was quite interesting. You see, they prided themselves not on working, but they prided themselves, their profession was as robbers. The highest level of Bedouin life is that you basically only eat what you take from others. You rob other tribes. So tribes are constantly robbing each other, and it's a really fascinating subject. In fact, one day I should make a video on Bedouin culture, comparing it to gang culture. It's very similar to street gang culture, in fact. Shockingly so. No one's ever done an anthropologic comparison in print or in video of Bedouin tribes and street gang culture. In fact, you can find like the poetry of Bedouin tribes very similar to the poetry that in rap music, for example, and the way of their living is also very similar. They're honor codes and so on, very similar. Which makes me think that this is sort of a natural human evolutionary mechanism. We develop into tribes naturally, and when we're not forced into a normal civilized society, this happens everywhere. So this takes us to late Ottoman times, where there were governorships under the Ottoman Empire ruling certain areas of the Arabian Peninsula, but generally there were nomadic tribes there moving in and out, really not controllable, not unified, and priding themselves on their lifestyle, their freedom, their honor, and so on. Also, another thing we have to remember about Bedouins is that, generally speaking, the Bedouins have been historically the least religious Arabs. Over time, since Islam began, the Bedouins have been the most likely people to not pray, to rebel against the Islamic society, to refuse to do certain things. And this was known since the Prophet's time. So for example, when the Prophet died, it was written that the women of the Arabian Peninsula celebrated. They put henna on their skins. You guys have heard of henna before. It's a temporary kind of tattoo. They put henna on their skins and dance. And many of the Bedouin tribes called for their own prophets, and others were happy to be rid of this kind of theology that came from Judaism. They felt free again, but they had control imposed upon them by the powerful, organized Islamic Arabs. But generally speaking, this happened many times throughout history. And by Ottoman times, the Bedouins were known to be not really religious in general. And we'll see some evidence of that both from my own experiences and from Western travelers in the area. Anyway, with all those introductions, let's finally talk about the UAE. What did the UAE look like in the early 20th century? By the early 20th century, the UAE was very influenced by Britain. But other than that, for the last few hundred years, the UAE was essentially inhabited by nomadic Bedouins that organized themselves into tribes. And in fact, there were two tribal confederations that frequently warred with each other. One was called Al-Hilf Al-Ghafri and one was called Al-Hilf Al-Hanawi. These two, Hilf by the way in Arabic means confederation. These two confederations were actually created by the Omanis. You see, the Sultanate of Oman, which by the way, Sultanate means just a place that's ruled by a sultan. The Sultanate of Oman at the time was inordinately powerful compared to these tribes. So they were really influenced by the politics of the Sultanate of Oman. Anyway, these tribes were frequently going to war with each other. And side note, by the way, the only reason that the Hilf al-Hanawi eventually won was because the British forbid the Hilf al-Ghafri from using the seas. And those people were very naval-oriented people. And because they couldn't use their ships, they were handicapped and eventually basically outpowered. Anyway, Hilf al-Hanawi occupied the southern Emirates, Dubai, Abu Dhabi. Abu Dhabi borders, by the way, on Saudi Arabia. And in particular, many of the tribes lived in an area called Liwa. On the other hand, the Hilf al-Ghafri occupied the northern Emirates. And they were led by a family called Al-Qawasim, which is also sort of a tribe because it's so big. And the Hilf al-Hanawi, by the way, was led by the Al-Nahyan and Al-Maktoum families that currently rule Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And by the way, as a side note, we can mention here that the UAE is the only country in the Arabian Peninsula that's ruled by tribal chieftains, not by random families that were imposed through their relationships with foreigners. And that's one reason that the rulers there have a bit more legitimacy than other rulers in the Arabian Peninsula and are generally beloved by their people and have less rebellions or people trying to overthrow them. Anyway, so the UAE was a place with Bedouin people that were constantly going to war with each other and so on. During this time, in the early 20th century, many Western explorers traveled through the area. In particular, one named Wilfred Thesiger, or Thesiger. I don't know how to say his name, I've never heard it said, but I've read most of his books. He traveled in the Trucial States and particularly spent a lot of time around Abu Dhabi and Dubai and the Northern Emirates. And he noted to his surprise how little the Bedouins seemed to be religious. In fact, they didn't pray. And they generally seemed to be doing a lot of things. They committed fornication without being married. They did many things that Wilfred Thesiger, being a British man, thinking that these were religious Muslims, would never have expected. In fact, he noted many times these tribes did not pray at all, or they prayed 3 times a day instead of 5 times, and this was until very recently. In fact, in the region we have a sort of joke about Bedouins. We call them Bedouizer, after the drink Budweiser, beer, because they tend to like alcohol as well. These Bedouins in general don't respect Islam in the kind of way that you would see, for example, Afghani or Pakistani people, or Egyptian people, city-dwelling Arabs. They don't respect Islam in exactly the same way. In fact, they find Islam, historically, there's been an antagonism between Arabic culture and Islamic culture. So for example, until very recently, Bedouin women used to tattoo themselves, which is completely forbidden in Islam, like it is in Judaism. But they still did it until very recently. In fact, if you go online, you can find pictures of tattooed Bedouin women. So what was life like for these people in the early 20th century? Well, by then, most of them, at least I would say 40% of them were somewhat settled. In Dubai, for example, they were quite settled. Ras Al Al Khaimah was an established city. There were people settled in various areas. And the reason many of these Bedouins actually settled in certain areas was mainly because of seasonal pearl diving. You see, the pearl trade was very important to the economy of the region before oil. And so Dubai, for example, the city that I'm from, was very dependent on this pearl trade. The pearl trade had depressions at certain times. For example, in the 1880s, there was a serious pearl trade depression. There was another one in the early 1900s, and that was the last one, sort of destroying the industry for everyone. After that last pearl trade depression, some people that were growing up in that time, including my grandfather, decided to do some kind of business. At the time, these people were actually made fun of by other Arab citizens of Dubai or Abu Dhabi that were more Bedouin. They thought of them as effeminate, trying to open stores and trade certain things instead of stealing from others. And in fact, to give you an example of how powerful the Bedouin culture remained in the early 20th century, let's look at an example that I heard from a primary source. Al-Majid, one of the greatest businessmen in Dubai and in the Arabian Peninsula in general, once visited my grandfather in the office while I was there, and I was privy to their conversation. What I heard while I was there, in fact, how it happened was Al-Majid was trying to speak well of my grandfather directly to me. So he was mentioning that, if it wasn't for your grandfather, I would have never gotten into business. And I asked why. He said at the time I had a grocery store that he opened in some part of Dubai. Basically, that's all they could do at the time. They would buy materials from other countries and try to sell them in the area and trade them in some kind of way. So he had essentially what amounts to a grocery store. He said everybody around the area, they lived in a Shandaga, part of Dubai, was making fun of him for having the store. And apparently my grandfather went into the store one day and encouraged him to continue doing business, and together they got into a fabric trade from Kuwait, and that's how they started business together. So Al-Majid himself told me that he was made fun of for getting into business initially, and I've heard similar things from my grandfather. The people at the time were very antagonistic toward this forward thinking. Now you would think people that are so conservative and so into their own ways would also be religious, but that's not the case at all. In fact, at the time there was a kind of religious instruction in Dubai, and it was led by certain individuals who usually taught people's children how to read Quran. Usually they were taught literacy through the Quran, and generally taught them maybe how to pray and a couple of other things. But generally these people did not know that much about Islam and didn't get into it that much. A lot of them didn't pray at all. In fact, some of the descendants of these limited Islamic teachers still exist today. For example, there's a family in Dubai called Gom bin Mijran. By the way, Dubai is the way we say Dubai in our actual accent. We don't actually say Dubai, we say Dubai. But anyway, they're the descendants. Bin means the son of, like in Benjamin. Benjamin means the son of. Jamin, which is actually Yamin, the right, son of the right. They're the descendants of Mijran bin Muhammad al-Marri. Mijran is also said in classical Arabic, Muqrin. Anyway, Mijran, he was called a Sheikh Mijran because he was a Sheikh, means like a term of endearment, and in this case refers to his religious piety or knowledge. He was sort of the most learned person in Dubai at the time, and he taught many of the children of the various families there how to read and how to read the Quran and maybe how to pray and get started in life. But generally this was a kind of very limited instruction at the time. Now we took an example of how powerful Bedouin culture was in the early 20th century with the discussion of these two businessmen that I mentioned. We also took an example of what kind of limited Islamic instruction they had with the example of Sheikh Mijran. But also let's take an example of how impious these people really were, or how different they were compared to what Western thoughts are of the piety of Arabian Peninsula Arab. For example, even close to the unification of the UAE, and maybe even past it, the Arabic women in the area were not veiled traditionally. They did wear veils, but it was a cultural veil. They weren't very careful about showing their hair. They did wear face masks, called a burqa, that was golden. But the reason they wore the mask was actually not because of a religious reason, but because of a Bedouin reason. It was a cultural thing for Bedouins. So for example, in the 70s, when some of the new generation of these Arabs, for example in Dubai, began to encounter Western clothing and wear it, they stopped wearing their classical Bedouin Arabic clothing, which may appear to Western observers as a kind of conservatism when they were wearing the traditional clothing, but it wasn't. It was conservative in regard to their nomadic Bedouin culture, not toward Islam. But anyway, the next generation, when they wore foreign clothes, they actually were not only not veiled, they took off the veil completely, but they were also wearing skirts. In fact, my aunt, who was a very religious and pious woman, recalled to me, she actually described it as if they... See, in Islam, there's a term for the pre-Islamic times, which they call the times of ignorance. She actually used that word to describe the 70s in Dubai and the UAE. She told me once, we knew so little about Islam, we didn't even know that we were supposed to cover ourselves. So when we had the Western clothing, we just wore skirts and we went out like that. She said it wasn't until the mid-70s or so that we started to learn that this was not allowed. But how did they learn this? Well, that's the crux of this whole video. There's a reason that the Emiratis suddenly started taking a different perception toward Islam. Two things happened. One, they cared a little bit more about Islam than the Bedouins originally did. You see, the Bedouins both had a lack of knowledge about Islam and a lack of interest. These people began to be interested in Islam because they were being called to Islam by a certain group of people, which we'll talk about next. And second, they learned details about Islam. But they learned this knowledge from a certain kind of interpretation of Islam that was called Salafism. This is again the ancestral kind of Islam that some people call Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia. But it's not directly connected to it. You see, where the Emiratis learned this kind of Islam from was from the Egyptians. And the Egyptians had a slightly different kind of look toward Islam than the Saudi clerics had. And where this interpretation of Islam came from was a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. These are not the same brotherhood that helped the Saudi rulers take over Saudi Arabia. It's a different brotherhood started by a man named Hassan al-Banna in 1928. The Muslim Brotherhood that you're hearing about here is the so-called terrorist organization that you probably heard about in the news before. You see, this Islamic organization existed since 1928 in Egypt and was generally mistreated, in particular at the time of Gamal Abdel Nasser, probably the only heroic leader of Egypt that ever existed. Gamal Abdel Nasser was a pan-Arab leader who led the war against Israel initially. He was eventually assassinated. In fact, they tried to assassinate him many times. In fact, there's a video of him dodging bullets and continuing a speech once. He was so heroic. But they eventually killed him. And he was replaced by one of the first traitors to the Arabs in the modern times, a man named Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat was the first ally of Israel that ruled in Egypt. He literally sold his soul to the devil, sold his people, and in doing so, he developed a lot of hatred among the Egyptian people. In order to appease the Egyptian people, he made some peace with the Muslim Brotherhood. Gamal Abdel Nasser was very harsh on the Muslim Brotherhood. He wanted to modernize and unify the Arabic people into one country. Whereas Anwar Sadat was a very obviously selfishly driven man who was essentially looking for his own power, and in doing so he wanted to appease the people so that he could maintain power. The Muslim Brotherhood was very popular, and so what he did was make peace with them and let many of them out of the very dangerous, torturous jails that existed in Egypt. When many of these Muslim Brotherhood left the jails there, they wanted to flee Egypt to ensure they weren't arrested again. Many of them came to the Arabian Peninsula and became teachers or even private tutors to the young children of these Bedouin Arabs. In this way, by the early 80s, a large population of the teachers that existed in the new schools that were being developed in the now modern UAE were actually Egyptians from the Muslim Brotherhood. And they taught these students their interpretation of Islam, an ancestral kind of Islam that these people were not aware of. And this kind of Islam did two things. One, it was much more restrictive and much more specific than the kind of Islam that these people knew before. Second, this kind of Islam was more powerful. It was more able to defeat the natural tribal culture of these settled, formerly nomadic Emiratis. Through the instruction from these Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood members, the Emirati population changed. Only the people that were the most stuck to their Bedouin ways retained their former culture. Most of the people that were settled, and every year more and more people in the UAE were settled, such that by the late 90s there were no longer actual Bedouins in the UAE. Most of these people had their sons and daughters in schools, taking instruction from these teachers. And the parents, unfortunately, maybe didn't refute the instruction from these teachers, such that this next generation grew up in the UAE without even realizing that they just experienced a major religious revival that didn't exist in the region for hundreds and hundreds of years. And consequently, by the early 90s, the fabric of the society of Emiratis had completely changed. I grew up in that society where it was rare to encounter Emirati women in public without a full face covering. And when you encountered somebody without a full face covering, you thought that they were doing something rebellious. We grew up not knowing our history. We didn't even realize that we experienced such a religious revival. I learned this much later in my life when I intentionally inquired about our history and read about it and spoke to so many people and heard these things from my own family members. My family being particularly religious, I was shocked to know that my aunt actually wore a skirt in the early 70s. Like me, many Emiratis have no idea that this happened whatsoever. They don't realize that this mass export of religious scholars from Egypt was the main contributing factor in the Arabian Peninsula, other than Saudi Arabia, becoming religious and adopting what's called Salafi Islam. Now, I've been very long-winded in this video. I don't even know if it's publishable, and I don't know if it'll be interesting to you guys, but I'm sure that this isn't discussed very often. I'm sure that Western observers that see Emiratis wearing their traditional clothes think, oh, these people people are stuck in their old ways. They are, but they're stuck in their Bedouin ways. That's why they wear the clothing. And even though they are quite religious, they're not as religious as you think. And the religiousness that they have is very recently imported, mainly from Egypt, from the Muslim Brotherhood. And also, as a prologue, you guys have heard about the Muslim Brotherhood. In 2011, the current ruler of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, was overthrown. And the next year, the Muslim Brotherhood was popularly, democratically elected to rule Egypt. And fascinatingly and ironically, one of the contributing factors to the Muslim Brotherhood being overthrown against the will of the population in Egypt was my country, the United Arab Emirates, which finally realized how destructive the Muslim Brotherhood was for themselves. Anyway, friends, that's how Emiratis became religious. I'll see you tomorrow morning.